These glowy spotlight border effect things are doing the rounds again. I'm told it's from Windows 10, but it always fascinates me how different people approach to build this in UI. So let's see how you could do it with one JavaScript event listener and some CSS custom properties. Let's grab our IDE and a browser window, and we need some elements. So I'm going to create a list with some cards in and give each card a number. And to do this, I'm using Emmet to save me some time and some keystrokes. Now we've got some HTML, we're ready for some CSS, and we can start with some cascade layers. We're going to have a base layer, which is going to just do some base styling to make the body dark and lay things out. And then we're going to have a second cascade layer for our card styles, and this is going to lay the cards out with display flex. And then we're going to set some sizing on the card, and using aspect ratio, we're going to go with something like 4:3. Those cards are looking a little cramped, so we can apply some gap to space things out. And then I'd like the numbers to appear in the bottom right corner of each card, so I'll set them all to position absolute and make sure I set position relative on the cards. Now I need some JavaScript so I can tell CSS the cursor position, and to do this I'm going to use the pointer move event, destructure the event, and then set two custom properties on the document.document element, which equates to root. If I hop into the browser and open up DevTools, I can see that those X and Y values are getting injected as custom properties in line. Part of me doesn't feel quite right letting the browser deal with all those floating points, so we can use math.round just to clean up those values. Now we're ready to create the spotlight effect using our X and Y custom properties. So we jump back into our CSS, and my first thought is to use those X and Y values within a radial gradient to update the circle position. And we can do that using calc var x times 1 pixel and calc var y times 1 pixel. And then I'll create a reduced opacity white circle. And we can set the size of the circle where we set the transparent color stop. So you could update this, but I've just gone with 150 pixels. Now we can see it's working, but not quite how we want. The background isn't relative to the viewport, it's relative to each card. So there is a fix for this, and it's pretty nifty. So we hop back in our CSS, and the magic property is background attachment with the value fixed. And now that works. Background attachment fixed fixes each card's background relative to the viewport. So now when we use the X and Y position, the spotlight is in the right position for each card. How can I create that glowy border effect? Well, a border image isn't quite going to cut it here, so how about a masked CSS pseudo element? That will do the trick. We can create our pseudo element with the content property and then position it so it covers the card using insert 0 and position absolute. CSS masking gives us a way to only show parts of an element that we want to. And we can define a mask much like we can a background image. So if we set a linear gradient white to transparent, we can see that it fades out half of our red pseudo element. And if we set that linear gradient white to white, nothing would be hidden. So the way you could approach this is to create 4 linear gradients, one for each border side, and then set their position and size using a custom property. So border width could be 6 pixels, create 4 linear gradients and create one for the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. And combining those 4 linear gradients as a mask for our pseudo element turns it into this kind of faux border element. Then I can get rid of that red background, and we want to share the radial gradient between this border element and the card, and the border element needs to be a little bit brighter. So the first thought might be to refactor the radial gradient into a custom property, and then we could use another custom property to set the alpha on our white color for the circle. I need to remember to use background attachment fixed on the pseudo element too. And if we check this out, it kinda looks right, but that brightness isn't as bright as it should be. And that's because our custom property background isn't quite working how we might expect. What's actually happening is the border looks slightly brighter just because it's 2 stacks of the background, but it's not actually using the alpha value we've defined. So how can you work around this problem? Well, use CSS, use the cascade. We can define a new rule that comes later after the alpha declarations that assigns the background to the card and its pseudo element, but uses the alpha values that have been defined higher up in our styles. We can see it's almost there, but now we've lost the card background, but the border is working as expected. It's much brighter than the card. What I could do is set a background custom property on the card and then have a background color at the end of our background declaration. And if it's not set, there isn't a background, but if it is, it sets one. So this looks fine, but how could I make it so the spotlight only appears on one card at a time? Well, it's gonna be custom properties to the rescue again. What I can do is set a custom property active to 1 when a card is hovered or say focused within, and then use that in a calc against the alpha value. By default, active is 0, so alpha would be 0. And then when the card is hovered, active becomes 1, so then the alpha becomes 0.15. This is a cool technique because the borders will always glow, and that means when we hover a card, we can see a slight glow on the siblings because their borders will show. And that's because we're only using calc against the alpha value of the card body. The only part I don't quite like here is how abruptly the spotlight turns on and off. On first thought, I might think to try and transition the background. But what would be better is to actually refactor our code so that both glows are handled by both pseudo elements after and before of the card. And then we can transition the opacity of the after element. Both alpha values can remain as their values, but the active custom property now controls the opacity of the body glow. And the last thing to make sure we do is set pointer events none on both of those pseudo elements. That way users can still interact with content on the card. And now that spotlight transitions much more smoothly. We got the effect we wanted with glowing cards only when they're hovered, but we also get the sibling borders. We used one JavaScript event listener, and we leaned into the power of CSS custom properties. How would you create this PC UI? Do you want to see me create something else? Let me know in the comments. And if you did enjoy this, please like and please subscribe so I make some more. Stay awesome.